The British Raj, as you may or may not know, officially came into existence following the complete dissolution of the East Indian Company in 1858. We can spend an entire video discussing the events preceding the dissolution of the EIC, but for the sake of this video, we'll be discussing not only how the transfer of power came to be, that being the transfer of power from the EIC to the British Crown, but also the several governmental judicial changes that were caused by the shift in government, as what would clearly be seen later on as the starting of a new era in colonial history. The focus for this video will also be directed towards strictly the noticing of changes in aspect to the government of the then British Raj. I will, however, be investing my future videos on the socio-cultural changes that took place throughout the span of the 19th century in India, as that equally serves as an imperative footnote into understanding the changes that would lead up to the rise of Indian nationalism in the 20th century. With all that being said, let's get to the video. Before further getting into the changes that were brought by the transfer of the power to the crown, it would be important for us to look into the state of the company. East Indian Company was in before the subsequent mutiny and the Royal Proclamation of 1858. As what would be clearly seen from my previous video, the transfer of power to the EIC and the eventual ceding of territory to them was a slow and gradual process that took place over the span of 2 centuries. This process of power play in the subcontinent took place in the backdrop of the British Crown, who have issued numerous charters that serve to control, regulate, and manage the company and its role in the newly ceded territories. Such were to be the case as seen in the Charter Act of 1698, the Regulating Act of 1773, and the most important of them all, the Pitt's India Act of 1784. Now, before explaining the importance of the Pitt's India Act of 1784, we need to get an understanding of the power dynamics that took place between the British Parliament and that of the Board of Control, the primary body behind controlling and administering the East Indian Company, that largely consisted of shareholders of the company and elected individuals respectively. Tensions between the Crown and the EIC were strenuous, as was obvious. A monarchical regime like that of the British Crown wouldn't be so pleased in having authorities earning money in the millions, if not billions, gallivanting without their equal say in how they were to be administered and functioned. Hence, the role of charters and decrees passed by the British Crown and Parliament were imperative in controlling and administering them. When the EIC over the decades proved itself repeatedly to be a force more than just a company trading spices and wealth offshore, further consideration was taken in by the Crown in containing and administering company officials situated thousands of miles from their homeland. Such were to be seen in the passing of the Regulating Act of 1773. The years prior to 1773, the EIC gained swaths of land in Bengal, Orissa, and neighboring states following their victory in the Battle of Buxar, which saw the defeat of coalition forces that were led against them. The main provisions of the Regulating Act were to be, of course, the acknowledgement of the authority the EIC held in the Indian subcontinent by providing centralized administration. Its main provisions, however, included the submission of documents and dossiers regarding civil and military issues to the government by the Court of Directors, with also the addition of judicial reforms and the creation of a Governor General and a Council of 4 members. Regardless of how much I'm straying off from the main topic, it's imperative to notice these changes, as they will later lead up to the total weakening of company authority in comparison to British Crown rule. Following the Regulating Act came the Pitt's India Act of 1884. The Pitt's India Act was in all senses a reform that focused more on providing more authority to the British government. Some of the reforms included a large and massive extension of British governmental control over the EIC that included the addition of a Secretary of State, Chancellor of Exchequer, and a Privy Council into the Board of Control. There was also a reduction of the Governor General Council to just 3 members, and the establishment of a dual system of control where the Board of Control would consist of British officials. The Pitt's India Act was officially enacted by the Parliament after a series of debates and talks regarding the authority and sovereignty the EIC had over its newly ceded territories. Given that it happened in such a short notice, Some of the changes and reforms, besides the ones mentioned, also included the fact that the Crown had the complete authority to remove an elected Governor General by the boards of directors, the eventual subordination of the other two presidencies, Bombay and Madras, to Fort William, and the right for the declaration of war by the Court of Directors and their respective committee. What can be seen from the mutiny is that the Crown intervention in company functions existed um, decades prior to the mutiny taking place. The company, as we would later see through reforms, would slowly but assuredly transmogrify itself into more of a political force in the subcontinent than a trading powerhouse that it used to be, governing large swaths of Indian territory that was subsequently ceded to company hands required a well organized army, a system of judiciary that mixed English law and Hindu and Muslim judicature, with eventually a system of education that made it sure to establish centers of higher learning. To further add to my point that the EIC was slowly turning itself into a political force, leaving its trading grassroots behind, let's look into the Charter Act of 1813 and the Charter Act of 1833. The Government of India Act of 1833 officially dissolved trade of the company within Indian borders, making it only possible for them to continue trading with China at the time. The Charter Act would later be renewed 20 years later, as was the common pattern with these Charter Acts that were passed by the Crown. The Charter Act of 1833 subsequently ended trade with China as well, making the EIC almost and solely a political body, with the addition of many other reforms that I will discuss in another video, as that might ignore the main crust of what I'm going to convey. With these two charters alone, one can gain the understanding that clearly power over trade and the EIC in general was slowly being wilted away from them. The gradual decline in EIC ownership and administration will be one of the primary causes of the 1857 mutiny. Policy failures in regulating the army and the natives caused an inexorable outburst that resulted in the death of hundreds of thousands of natives and whites, as the Manchester Guardian would later write. Belief in horrible stories of torture, mutilation, and dishonor worse than death inflicted on our own countrymen and countrywomen in India has been universal. The East Indian Company's worldview, of course, being fixated under the belief that the Indian race was, for the most part, a harmless race, and their rule over the subcontinent was legitimized under a litany of worldviews and beliefs that saw themselves at top according to their divine providence. Events that unfolded during the mutiny proved how weak and fragile company rule really was in the subcontinent. That at any given moment, given the right cooperation and coordination, the natives could easily oust company rule through brute force alone. The British couldn't afford losing a colony like India. As a famous quote would go, without India, Great Britain would subside into a third rate state, which was noted by a well known contemporary at the time. The role the soon to be crown jewel of the British Empire was vital in sustaining the empire. Hence, officially in the year 1858, August the 2nd, the British power was officially transferred from company rule to the crown. Trust over the company ruling huge swaths of land like that of India was generally met with outrage and distrust towards the company by the people over Britain. Malpractices, corruption, and a slew of mismanagement saw the revolt of 1857 by the officials over at London as a godsend, and thus finally ended a company that founded itself in the year 1600 by the passing of a Charter Act that would later go on to rule a whole subcontinent for a long but strenuous tenure that saw periods of tumult, but mostly a stable government under the aegis of the Governor General and his council. The obvious effects of the 1857 revolt posed to the British were quite conspicuous. Company rule by the time was deemed as ineffective at trying to quell or neutralize rebellions in the subcontinent, despite their attempts at trying to do so. Some of the reforms planned out by the British government, by the British Crown, included myriads of different changes throughout the governmental framework by which the company had been ruling all this while, with the addition of reforms added to the army, which will be discussed at this moment. The army, as you may know, gave the main impetus for the revolt to unfold. The revolt officially began when sepoys decided to call against their higher ups and declare a mutiny. This, of course, caused the Crown to further look into the framework with which the army by then was functioning with. Some of the main problems the army had faced till then were, of course, the disproportionate ratio Indian soldiers and European soldiers were in. Gone were the days of Robert Clive and his army of Indian and European soldiers. As a result of the concerns brought by the British government, a royal commission was officially established with the intent of looking into what brought such a massive um, change amongst the army and the sepoys. Indeed, the Peel Commission, as it would come to be known as, would later submit a series of regulations that aimed towards reducing the disproportionate ratio Indian soldiers were in compared to their European counterparts. Furthermore, the Commission recommended around 80,000 European soldiers to be present all throughout the subcontinent. With the addition of these changes came another prophylaxis that aimed at bringing in disunity among the Indian soldiers. Of course, a united army with a common cause beyond just maintaining the status quo would be frowned upon by the authorities. Hence, the Commission also recommended the recruitment of Indian soldiers from distant parts of the country in order to sow dissent and, well, dissent in the sense that of disunity, with the soldiers being of different dialect and community, also the soldiers consisting of certain castes. You might be aware of the term martial race that included a variety of different groups throughout the subcontinent that were deemed by the British as martial race, a race that is almost warlike. The aim, of course, was to embroil a sense of disunity so that such a revolt of such a similar magnitude were not to unfold again if the soil were to be fertile enough. And indeed, that would be observed. Indeed, what could be observed is that the system worked for the most part, as Indian soldiers never particularly rose up in such a grand scale as that of 1857, unless we are mentioning mutinies that obviously unfolded throughout the history of the Raj. Other changes also include the fact that it is now possible for Indian soldiers to rise up through ranks, not just by the seniority, and restrictions held against them in the system were slightly but not entirely alleviated. Another rather important action that was implemented was the massive disarmament of the entire nation. This was in order to maintain and ensure domestic security within the region. Magistrates were given the authority to enter homes carte blanche in search for any weapons. With the following changes being taken place in a massive scale, other reforms took place in a rather political sense, which will be discussed further on. In order to get a better understanding of how exactly the Act of 1858 came into action, one needs to get an understanding of the context. And of course, what I mean by the context is a whole rigmarole of different bills being passed, members of the Whig Party or the Tory Party being kicked out, ousted, and scandals being thrown here and there. Of course, it includes um, a completely different rigmarole of different actions that are passed by the House of Commons. So, in order to get a better understanding of the situation, I ended up creating a flowchart which kind of describes the entire situation of how exactly the Act of 1858 was actually passed. Obviously, it's kind of a brief summary, but I will explain. I'll try my best to actually explain the flowchart that I just created. So, the Act of 1858, as would come to be known as, was very important and imperative, especially in regards to how exactly it affected the transfer of power from the EIC to the Crown. And this also plays an imperative role in. It also played a really imperative role in completely altercating the governmental framework with which the subcontinent was functioning at the time. The very framework, what would be considered as sacrosanct for the Act of 1858, was first established by Lord Palmerston. Now, who exactly is Lord Palmerston? Well, Lord Palmerston was the the Prime Minister of the Whig Party. So now you might be asking, what exactly is the Whig Party? Well, think about it. British politics at the time was largely dominated by the Whigs and the Tories. The Tories were, rather conservative. They were conservative leaning folks, and the party was more or less conservative leaning. Um, while the Whig Party, on the other hand, was largely a liberal, what do you say, a liberal leaning party. And the Prime Minister at the time was of the Whig Party was Lord Palmerston. Lord Palmerston was, being the Whig leader party prime minister, was provided a series of, well, what you would say, bills that came to be known as the Palmerston Bills. The Palmerston Bills were basically the very framework with which later the Act of 1858 would come to be played as. The Palmerston Bills basically consisted of the fact that the bifurcated system, that being the system with which the government of India at the time was actually functioning in, that being the dual system that was initially agreed in the Regulating Act of 1773. What exactly is a dual system now? The dual system can be broadly defined as the system that was established where the Crown, as well as the Board of Directors or the Governor General and his council, would have an equal say in how exactly the colony would be functioned as. Of course, over time, the EIC would slowly wilt away in its prominence and um, uh, say in how exactly the government would be, how exactly the subcontinent would be functioned, considering how precarious the situation was by the end of the century, by the end of the middle century, 18th, but the mid 18th, 19th century. The Tories and the Whigs would eventually come into a unanimous agreement. So basically, the both the liberals and the conservatives basically finally agreed on a point, saying that, you know what, it's time for us to finally abolish the bifurcated system, the dual system that was established by kind of, as Palmerston famously said in his writings, that we need to find a way to kind of simplify the framework with which India was functioning at the time. This, of course, included the fact that the governmental framework with which the EIC was working on the Indian subcontinent had to be removed, and the Crown had to take direct intervention. However, the Palmerston Bill, which of course included the what do you say? It includes some provisions like having an eight-member council system where the British government, the Crown, the House of Commons would have a direct say over who exactly would be elected in the council, as well as having a direct say of who exactly would be in the board of directors. The Palmerston Bill would, however, be cancelled and rejected as he is ousted because of some controversy. The controversy would be some act of murder, well, something related to murder around that premise. The Lord Palmerston would eventually have his bill rejected, as I said previously, and um, the Tory government, which would later on go on to take over, and the Whig Party would kind of be in the sideway in British politics by the time. Would the government would be formed on the premise of the Tory government, and the Disraeli, the famous individual in the government, takes suggestions from Lord Ellenborough, the former head of the board of directors and the former Governor General of India. Disraeli would later go on to take suggestions from Ellenborough, and these suggestions would, however, receive criticisms and are rejected. And then the bill that was supposed to be passed by Disraeli, back then he was the finance minister, the of Exchequer. Disraeli suggestions that were, of course, taken from Ellenborough were eventually and subsequently rejected. Um, However, despite the whole rigmarole that I just explained, that being Lord Palmerston's bill being cancelled, and Disraeli coming in the action, and then suggesting his reforms from taken from inspirations from Ellenborough. Despite all of that, Lord Stanley, another individual in the government, secures a complete approval from the House of Commons, which would later form the very basis of the 1858 bill. The act that would come to be known as the Act of 1858 would give the Secretary of State quite immense powers. Those were some of the very basic reforms, and well, the imperative changes that were actually instituted following the dissolution of the EIC. As the head of the council, the Secretary of State had authority both over the board of control members and the elected members. The plan and distribution of the members of the council went with a total of 15 members. So, in total, the council would have a total of 15 members, with, according to Lord Dalhousie, 8 members being elected by the Crown directly, while the other 7 members of the council being elected by the board of directors of the company. Palmerston initially decided on an 8-member system, which I actually mentioned before, but of course, it was promptly rejected by Lord Derby. And the above system would only be considered under a lot of consideration. Overall, the following were the functions that were specifically reserved for the Crown: appointment of 8 members in the Council of India, removal of any member from the above council from office, appointment of Governor General and 4th ordinary member, which by the way included jurors or people who had to kind of catalog the entire council meetings and sessions that were held, and the appointments into the military. The Act, in some sense, virtually gave total and absolute control for the Secretary of State, in some sense, with the addition of the fact that the Act only served some minor but temporary effects in the subcontinent. As you may or may not know, the Act of 1858 was, initially deemed as something monumental. It was deemed as a thing that kind of changed the very framework of how India would be governed. But as it turns out, many of the people, as well, many of the natives, view this as yet another sham by the British government. The changes obviously saw that the Secretary of State pretty much was given absolute authority. Also, the change from Governor General to Viceroy was also present. As you may or may not know, people often try to throw the term Viceroy around, and it. In order to get an understanding of the situation, you have to understand that the term Viceroy kind of was at its very primitive state by around the 1850s. It was only around 1858 the term Viceroy was actually first used instead of Governor General. However, it was, of course, met with some form of criticism. The Viceroy, of course, was, given kind of equal authority in some sense to the Secretary of State, although there was some power dynamics for some obvious reasons. The dynamics, as I mentioned before, would also include the fact that the Viceroy was if not the most highest paid government officials in the British Crown at the time. They earned a salary of well around thousands of pounds, making them kind of rich compared to most of their governmental counterparts. With that being said, we kind of get an understanding that the system that was established after the government sought a change that kind of let the British government and let the Crown have a direct intervention into some of the things that were going on in the subcontinent. As you may or may not know, the council was changed. The British government had a say on electing members for the council. The Secretary of State was directly elected by the British council, by the British government. So, in a sense, the many cogs that were otherwise found between the EIC and the government present in London were kind of rusty, and then it kind of required some greasing, which saw the system kind of become more refined in some sense. Another important side note, which is often mentioned after the mutiny, is the famous Queen's Proclamation. That is something really important because it kind of gives way to the very eve of the British Raj. It kind of says to the people who are in this system that look at what's happening. You're going to have a completely new system, you're going to have a completely new government, and you're going to have a completely new era that came to be known as the eve of the Raj. The famous proclamation was made on 1858 on the 1st of November. The infamous declaration sought to introduce the new eve of the Raj to the people of the heathen nations. It ensured things like full employment into the governmental system imposed by the English, as well as their role and involvement in the system. Another thing to note would be the solidarity she shared with the Rajas and the native princes of India, stating with all the treaties and agreements made at the EIC prior would be accepted by them unanimously. Furthermore, the declaration also outlines certain assurances like respect of religious toleration, equal and impartial protection of the laws, free and impartial admission to government service of subjects of race and creed, recognition of rights in land, etc. In the most broadest sense, the 1858 proclamation by Queen Victoria kind of stated out some of the many Gladstonian liberal values that were actually present at the time. The Queen Victoria famously said that now all of you are suddenly equal under the law, all of you can take part in the government, all of you can somehow work in the system that was established, however oppressive it might be. And all of that played an extremely important imperative role in kind of leading forth what exactly would be the events after 1858. Obviously, the 1858 Act would also have very vital importance for many of the members of the early EIC, INC, sorry, not the EIC, the Indian National Congress. As you may or may not know, Dadabhai Naoroji famously used the Queen's proclamation as well as the documents. Obviously, the INC and the very founders of it were in many ways moved by the Queen Victoria's proclamation of 1858. So, what could be understood from all these changes is that clearly the very sacrosanct of what would come to be, of what would later come in India's history, was basically laid upon after the mutiny, as it had had a an immense, imperative, incorrigible impact in the Indian subcontinent, and would later lead to many changes, both constitutionally, socioculturally, and economically in the system in the Indian subcontinent, as Vinobhai Savarkar actually famously said that the 1857 revolt was known as the Great War of Independence. It indeed was, and everything that followed it was basically, well, the people picking up and finding new alternative ways in trying to reform the system. With that being said, I would like to actually end this video by stating that the events that would follow the 1858 Queen's Proclamation would be later discussed in some of my up and coming videos. I plan on making even more videos as I'm supposed to. Obviously, school kind of took a really terrible toll on me. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I would like to end the video here, and obviously I did take a lot of research, and the links for everything will be provided in the description. Make sure you subscribe. It would mean a lot for me, especially the channel being in its very inception. I hope you found this video informative, because obviously not a lot of videos are present in YouTube that kind of discuss the early periods of colonial history, and the period of Indian history that I'm discussing right now, which kind of seem to be in this esoteric quagmire of back channeling talks and whatever. So yeah, I would like to end my video here. I'll probably be uploading a new video depending on how well this video is received. So yeah, thank you. Hope you enjoy the video.